Hey, how's it going, everyone? I've been meaning to do this video for a while. So when I got into started posting flat Earth videos on my channel, I've had a few people talk about moon bounce as a way to support, what the distance to the moon is, and that is one way either it was calculated or reaffirmed. But as an electrical engineer, I have questions about that. I've never done it myself in my undergrad program or grad program. Even heard the term moon bounce in my life, and so if that's an American education system thing, I don't know and I doubt. But let's just go with it that it's a thing, and so it's something that a few ballers at least will point um, to act as support for what the distance to the moon is. So now let's get into sort of the engineering behind that and the natural questions one would have, if they're going to use that as a support or as an experiment um, or as a mechanism for discovering, the distance to something. And so the first question I would have is, the device that is emitting the signal, what is the signature? What is the sort of wavelet? What is the characteristics of that source signal in the time domain? What is what was the logic behind using that to propagate these waves? And so it is only based on that source signature that we have decided ourselves that we can look for its distortion and its delay when it returns. And so if we're not sending out anything that we know the characteristics, not just the frequency, but the actual frequency composition of a source signature, without that, we don't know when it returns, what to wait for, and so that source signature, that wavelet, we need to understand its characteristics. And once it's transmitted, when it comes back, with distortion and amplitude, phase, and with a time delay, that is the way that one could, infer certain characteristics of what that thing has bounced off of and interacted with. And so the next question then would be, just kind of the theory that, just for those who are maybe not so familiar with concepts in electrical engineering, something in the time domain, a signal in the time domain, which is what I'm referring to as this source signature, can also be represented in frequency domain. So it can be characterized by its frequency components. And so there's a time frequency duality where it's like we know that the time is inverse of frequency. So if you're narrow in frequency, then you're broad in time, and if you're narrow in time, you're broad in frequency. And so that relationship exists. That's just something to keep in mind. That's just like a known thing. And so we do have concept of negative frequencies just for like mathematical purposes, but a lot of that is strictly like a mathematical construct, because in a way that would imply like a negative period or like negative time, which is non-physical. And so the duality doesn't hold, necessarily all the time in real life, but certainly from like a mathematical perspective, and for the purposes of signal analysis, it's very, very useful to go back and forth between time domain and frequency domain, because a lot of the calculations actually end up simplifying in the frequency domain. So let's just know now that if we have a time domain signal and then we're transmitting that, which I call the source signature, propagating it through space, modulated by a certain carrier frequency, then we can blast that thing out there. And then so its interaction with everything around it will cause it to come back to, our transmitting unit, if it's able to receive as well, and distort it and all that kind of stuff. And so in order for us to infer something about what it's hitting off of, that thing that it's hitting off of would have to have unique characteristics. Like you can't have two things next to each other, or one thing, along the direction of the transmitted wave that has the same characteristics as the thing that you're trying to isolate. So just to kind of a simplified example is like, you couldn't have two moons that are in the same kind of line of sight of this signal, because you don't know whether it's reflecting off the first one or the second one, or even making it to the second one. And so the uniqueness of what it's hitting off of is very, very important. Whether it's unique in space, but also it has to be unique in terms of its what's called frequency response. So when this signature is being sent out and it's hitting the moon, it's being distorted and interacting with the characteristics of the moon. And let's think of it in frequency domain. That source signature has a frequency response, and the moon would have a frequency response. And if you multiplied them together, you would get kind of a new effective resulting waveform that would be reflected back towards the transmitting unit. And so that frequency response to the moon would need to be understood. So these moon bounce people would need to explain how we got that and how it's unique. How do we know that it is not the same as the frequency response of other things, in the atmosphere? And so that's something I have a feeling they would not be able to answer. And so that's very, very important in order to be able to have some kind of, rigorous way to say, this reflected signal came back, it came distorted this way, it was delayed by this amount, and we know it was caused. This delay with this distortion was caused by the moon. And so that's at least the kind of beginning point for us to, believe anything that people say related to moon bounce. And so that's a good way to start the discussion. That's just common sense. You don't have to be like a genius to know that. This is obviously things that one would ask even if they didn't know anything about, convolution or, signals in the frequency domain or anything like that. But signals that interact with one another, there's just sort of it's basically like a natural law. Convolution is a good way to understand what the resultant signal is when you have two signals that are interacting with one another and you want their output. It turns out that in nature, convolution is a way to predict what the output signal will look like. And the nice feature of convolution is that convolution in the time domain is actually multiplication in the frequency domain. And so that's where, things like Fourier transform, if you hear these terms, Fourier transform, Laplace transforms, they'll take, essentially they'll take integrals. They'll take things that are, a form of convolution and convert it into multiplication in the frequency domain. So they'll essentially turn them into like algebraic equations. And you remove the need of doing integrals, which are computationally obviously possible, but intensive. And then but also a bit more intuitive to understand. So the frequency response of this source signature hitting the moon, coming up with a new, signal after it interacts with the moon and returning back, you would then, if this were to be true, that the moon has a unique frequency response, one could infer, the potentially using this method, the distance away the moon is from that transmitting unit. And so, we would need to know that what the frequency response of the moon is, and how do we know that it's unique to all the things in the path of this transmitted signal. So, I just put that out there for people who have heard this moon bounce thing, just to like push back, or at least, for us to be able to ask questions. A lot of stuff that I've seen are just really long, almost spam-like posts that, my cousin's brother did it. He's a ham radio operator and this and that. And so I've done a project in undergrad, not sending and receiving a signal, but just receiving a signal from Ottawa, Ontario, and my undergrad school was in London, Ontario. And it was basically like just a time signal, like it was just a pulse. Every like few seconds we would hear like a beep. And so based on the frequency, the period of that signal, we knew that we were capturing that time signal from Ottawa. And so, we were building, this receiver, from off-the-shelf parts. We were even like wrapping our inductors ourselves just to get an understanding of how it works and how to build one. And so we were doing a lot of stuff at a very sort of granular level. And like, it was real. Like we were able to make a receiver, tune it to that frequency, and hear it, and actually know that, the circuit that we designed was sufficient in being able to capture that signal. And so that was similar to this in the sense that the source signal, in this case, this time signal in Ottawa, had certain characteristics that, you know, my professor knew because he was using this project for years. So he knew like where it was, characteristics of its frequency, its amplitude, what, you know, reach it had, how far away it could be detected, and all that kind of stuff. And so it was a reliable signal that, you know, allowed him to create a project like this, to create a receiver year over year. And we were basically just judged by when we hooked it up, could we hear it? You know, could the speaker that we had in our receiver like produce that sound? And, you know, it was obvious, like right when someone hooked it up and, you know, mine was able to work, you know, you could just, once it started clicking, you know, it would just be like click, click, click. And then we knew that, you know, it was receiving that signal. And so even that is potentially not rigorous in the sense that it could be another signal. You know, there could have just coincidentally been another signal with that frequency, or in another frequency, or in another location, you know, just transmitted with those same characteristics, and we were picking up on that. And so, you know, that's possible. And so there is an issue even of uniqueness in that situation. But, and so all these things about, you know, uniqueness, are we really interacting with the moon and all that would need to be addressed with rigor. You know, it's like just because we're hearing the beep doesn't, you know, in many ways guarantee that, or in some ways guarantee that, you know, we've captured the exact signal in Ottawa that we were intending to. And so that's a very important thing to push back with ballers, especially when they, you know, use it as quote unquote proof. You know, we have to dig down, ask for details, and ask for uniqueness of solution. So hope everyone's doing well. Take care. Bye.